The righteous shall live by his faith. War on the border, weakness within, the fruit of every field of sin. So went the prophet's sore lament when Chaldeans to his land were sent. And so to England came the Dane to challenge Alfred's waning reign. Alfred the Great, King Alfred the Great, is a model of faith for our postmodern times, which makes sense, of course, because he was situated in the 9th century, in pre-modern times. But more significantly, the circumstances of Alfred's life parallel that of our modern times. And just generally, we can consider these. He dwelt among a people who had forgotten their faith. And he was also facing attacks from outside his kingdom of those who utterly forsook his faith. And so here we are in a post-Christian nation, a post-Christian Western world, facing many of the same circumstances. But there are also a parallel for the time of the prophet Habakkuk, who in the Old Testament saw the same circumstances. So here's what we see. There's a principle laid down in the book of Habakkuk to how to respond to these circumstances. That principle was proven in the life of King Alfred, and it becomes a promise for how to persevere in faith for you and me. In the book of Habakkuk, where we pick up in our reading, it's at the beginning of his letter. He says, "Lord, how long shall I cry for help?" It's his great lament. "Or cry out to you violence, and you do not save." So there was violence in his land, within Israel. It was a violence first and foremost to the kingdom of God, to the very nature of that kingdom. Violence to the faith, for those who were forsaking the faith. But certainly violence to one another as well. And so we can relate to that, to violence in our modern world. It's been in the headlines increasingly over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 2 months. And so this kind of violence there's violence and there's violence, right? There's just reasons to resist force with force. But what he was referring to was a selfish pursuit of power and a hedonistic pursuit of pleasure that led to that violence. And so he says, "Why do you make me see iniquity in my own land? Why do you idly look at wrong? Why are you not doing something about this, God?" But then God gives the answer, and it's not included in our lectionary reading because there's an ellipsis in between the beginning of chapter 1 and our reading picks up in chapter 2. Here we have God's answer to Habakkuk. He says, "Don't worry, I am raising up the Chaldeans. He will take care of these people." But then we have a second lament from Habakkuk, who says, "God, the Chaldeans are worse." Talk about violence and pursuit of pleasure. And he describes them. He says, "Therefore, he," referring to he, the Chaldean, more generally, personifying the Babylonians, "he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich." Now let's connect this to the scenario of Alfred the Great. So the Danes were like the Chaldeans. The Danes, if you heard about the Vikings and you've heard about their marauding, and you think they're bad, if you look closely at the history of this period of Alfred's life, I guarantee you they're worse than you think. The way they would come, rape and pillage without mercy. And so one thing that Alfred understood, which is parallel also to the book of Habakkuk, is that the Danes were coming in judgment of his own people. You think of the great monastery of Lindisfarne, still of great renown. But in his day, that monastery had become lax. gradually over time, perhaps imperceptible at first, the great holiness in there gave way to a laxity and even a pursuit of pleasure. And so these monasteries were sacked, along with city after kingdom of England, until it was whittled down to the final kingdom of Wessex, which is ruled over by Alfred the Great. But the thing with these Danes is that they would pillage and live in luxury in a town and utterly drain it until they moved on to another. Easy prey were the people of England. And so when they would do so, they were utterly merciless. When they captured kings, and there's a record of 2 of them, they mutilated those kings in a way that I couldn't describe from the pulpit here, ritually sacrificing them. And so this was their means. And Alfred faced this if he were ever to be captured. But to make things worse, his nobles, who had pledged an oath to him, saw the advancing pillaging of Guthrum, the Dane who had finally come into Alfred, the last Dane kingdom, Wessex, and was making great progress and felling town after town. So to save their hides, they pledged their allegiance to Guthrum. And so Alfred was betrayed. Similar to what we hear from Habakkuk, where Habakkuk says, "Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" Let's just say something briefly, by the way, about Alfred, who also parallels a righteous prophet like Habakkuk. He stands in contrast to the iniquity of these Danes, because he was someone, by the way, when he was a young man, was so concerned about his temptation to sexual sin that he asked for an affliction to keep him from that. Just before he got married, if the affliction was too great, he asked that God lift it, which God did immediately, as he tells his good friend and biographer. But then he received another affliction, which he maintained as a goad to holiness for the rest of his life. So he was a man of principle, whose annihilation was sought by those who had no principle whatsoever. And in light of this, he was exiled. His nobles had no longer supported him. He had only a small band of supporters he had to retreat in hiding to a marshy hill far away from his estate. And so from here, he had a very dark time of his life. And what do we have for Habakkuk as a word from God who faced similar circumstances? Here's what he says. "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. Behold, the soul of the Chaldean is puffed up. It is hot. It is not upright within him." But then here's the promise. "But the righteous shall live by his faith." This is the word that Alfred had while he was exiled on a marshy hill in hiding. Now, this can be an encouragement to us, I hope, but it's very easy just to have a fideistic understanding of this, which doesn't help us when all the odds are against us. It doesn't always help us to say, "Oh, don't worry, God will take care of it." Because soon enough, Guthrum would go ahead and find him on that marshy hill, and that would be the end. You can still trust that God would take care of it, but that would literally be the annihilation of all the Saxon people. Because those nobles, by the way, who capitulated to Guthrum, well, he honored their fealty to him by continuing to pillage and rape their villages as well. So the problem with this pagan mentality is that the ends justify the means. There are no principles. All that matters is that we achieve our power, we achieve our pleasure, and everything else can serve that. All that matters is what happens in the end. And so we see this not only here, but throughout history. Let's just consider the same mentality, and I'm quoting right now from Gary Saul Morrison. He's a professor of Slavic language and humanities at Northwestern University. And so in a Touchstone article, he talks about this basic principle in communist Russia. It says, it followed that refraining from destroying an enemy when possible is itself immoral according to the Leninist understanding. Lenin once called for a Bolshevik leader who had refrained from taking maximal advantage from an opportunity to be examined for mental illness. So you just annihilate your enemy. There's no principles. That's the principle. There's no mercy. There's no overarching principles of care for our enemies. We demonize them. And so likewise, when Alfred had tried to make treaties with Vikings in the past, before Guthrum came into his kingdom, here's what happened multiple times. When they would make a treaty, they would exchange hostages in good faith. Some of my nobles will go over to your side. We'll take some of your nobles over here to make sure we're both faithful. And so what Guthrum did is immediately the next day slit the throats of his nobles and then continued to rape and pillage. Oaths meant nothing. And so when God says, don't worry, the righteous will live by faith, well, we've got an uneven playing field. They've got tactics that the righteous doesn't have access to. How do we fight against this? So the temptation, of course, is to say, that's it. I've had enough. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to, an eye for an eye, fight fire with fire. We need to hate them the way they hate us. And isn't that a temptation that we face today? And we could park here for a while, just take a few moments, but let's just consider, when you have someone, no matter how much you might have been convinced to hate a speaker, to take him out with a gunshot, that is justified if the ends justify the means. Or in Manchester, England, if you believe that globalizing the Intifada means the ends justify the means, and sure, it's honorable to take out an old man going to his prayers. But it's not just the people who we call radicalized who do these things. It's our very neighbors who cheer these things on, which is the group psychology that accompanies all of these kinds of terrors, where the ends simply justify the means. How do we fight against that? By just saying, oh, just have faith. So now let's consider for a moment what it's like for us when we are on the marshy hill of our own. How do we respond to this? How do we maintain our principles against these types of odds? Well, let's consider what happened for Solzhenitsyn when he was in prison. Now, he was basically an atheist himself, but what he found out about the prisoners that he was with as he was rounded up under Soviet Russia, he said, if only the result counts, like the ends justify the means, that was their slogan, only the result counts, then one should do whatever it takes to survive. And he found that convinced communists really did not hesitate to sacrifice others, their fellow prisoners. This is just what happens. But he said there's a fork in the road, and Solzhenitsyn took that fork in the road, the right fork, where you save your soul. And he said, we prisoners have been climbing up to an understanding of life, and from this height, it can all be seen so clearly. It is not the result that counts. It is not the result. It is the spirit. So for somebody who is called to reclaim their faith, Paul has words for Timothy. God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. This is what matters. This is the soul. And as one Nobel laureate said around the same time, she realized there's two different kinds of courage. There's a courage that one has in battle and one acts along with others. But in thinking and doing what is right, one acts by oneself. When fighting a battle, one's life is at stake. When thinking and acting alone, it is one's soul. And I wish I had time to recount the credible tales of how Alfred, in his darkest moments, did just this, had to take account of his soul and make a choice. How will I respond? And ultimately, the only response is this. It's ultimately the cross. Because Jesus says so clearly, we may not fight evil with evil means. As simple as that. If someone, and by the way, if somebody asks you to go 1 mile, go 2. If somebody asks for your shirt, give them your cloak as well. And so the cross, however, turns the tables, where we're able to sacrifice ourselves for a cause and trust in God's victory in the end. So how does this play out? Well, ultimately, Alfred refused to give up the fight. With just a few supporters, he went on campaigns to intercept some Vikings, small Viking bands, and their raping and pillaging. And word got out to the countryside, to the people, that Alfred is fighting valiantly. So apart from those capitulating nobles, he was able to bring forth himself again, once again, an army. And I wish I had more time to recount, but through virtually miraculous means, he was able to corner Guthrum and defeat him in battle. But what did he do to Guthrum when he was cornered, when Guthrum finally had to sue for peace? Did he take vengeance? Did he mutilate him like the other Vikings did? No. He required that Guthrum be baptized. Simple as that. So someone says, oh, how humiliating to baptize him against his will. How genuine is that? Well, you understand, in this day, if you became a godparent to someone, then the one who is baptized has all the rights of a natural child. So legally, by what Alfred did is he insisted on being the godfather to Guthrum. So Guthrum became part of his family. And so what happened is Guthrum, as was the tradition then, wore white robes for a week. But for 12 days, they feasted. And Alfred showered gifts abundant upon Guthrum and his whole family and 30 nobles who were baptized with him. This is the same Guthrum who sought to murder Alfred and murdered many of his kinsmen in cold blood. This is how we turn the tables. And Guthrum, by the way, was the only Dane who ever ended up keeping his oath to Alfred, despite many betrayals from Danes throughout his entire life. And so one thing that was significant as we look for how to bring this together and how to have hope for our future is that Alfred understood that, yes, we need to fortify our cities and have a better militaristic strategy against the Danes who kept on trying to raid and topple Wessex throughout his entire life. But he understood if we're really going to fortify our land, our people need to renew their faith. So Alfred, on his own, learned Latin and translated into the vernacular Boethius' The Consolation of Philosophy, St. Gregory's Pastoral Care, and the first 50 Psalms. He insisted that his nobles learn to read and made this required reading. That was what you had to do if you were going to keep your post. Then he also established laws that wove fidelity into the small things of life. Oath-keeping was primary. If you broke an oath, you're ostracized. You're out. Otherwise, how can society hold together? And he understood that it's the little fidelity that matters. Consider our society today. Pornography is understood as one of the reasons why there's so much violence in our land, because it's utterly dehumanizing. Couldn't we use some laws to address that? And he also made sure that his own people had the faith so that they would be strengthened spiritually in order to be strengthened as a people. But as we are on our marshy hills, when we are still in hiding, how do we maintain our faith? Well, let's consider the words of Habakkuk at the end of his book. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the field yield no fruit, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. So is there an uneven playing field? Absolutely there is. It's an uneven playing field for anyone else when the Lord is working on our behalf. So let's consider those opening verses once again and finish them. War on the border, weakness within, the fruit of every field of sin. So went the prophets, sore lament, when Chaldeans to his land were sent. And so to England came the Dane to challenge Alfred's waning reign. And such evils we must face to save again the human race. All we need, our God will give, for by faith the righteous live.